Good morning. My name is Joanne Brown. Are you a good sleeper? I'm not. And I spend a lot of hours in the dark. And when I do, I play the remember game. I go to my friends' homes, places in Spokane, and I remember. And one of my favorites is I remember my church. Because even though I've lived in 4 houses in my lifetime, I've always had the one constant of this church home, and I love it. And I think I'm the last one to remember it in its phases. I missed the phase when it was just the West Room and the basement, but I know this face that you see in the congregation in the sanctuary now, but it didn't always look like this. There were 4 big doors on each side of the room, which were made to open up if there was a large crowd. That only happened once in my lifetime. But then, first the doors on the east side were gone, and then the doors on the west side to make space. What a wonderful reason. On the east side of the church was a room that took in the hallway, pastor's office, the narthex, the stairway, and it looked just like the west side, except the west side had a small room that extended from the north wall to the first pillar, and then all the way to the bell was the rest of the room. That was a church I grew up in. I don't exactly remember the early primary years, but I've come here since I was born. I distinctly remember being baptized here on the Easter that I was 6. But the years I began to remember were the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grades in Sunday school, when we met in this west room, and my teacher was Mrs. Courtney, and after we had the Bible lesson and our Sunday school lesson, when it was over, we all got a stick of gum, which was a big deal in those days. When I was 12, I whined and begged to join the MYF. But let me tell you how a Sunday was in this church when I was young. The bell rang for 9:30 Sunday school. We came into the sanctuary, had a half-hour service with songs and announcements, and then we went to our classroom. And at 10:30, we were dismissed from our classrooms to come back to the sanctuary and sing a closing song. Then, most of the children went home or were picked up, or they waited for their parents to come to church at 11. And at 10 to 11, the bell started ringing for church. The bell always rang twice every Sunday, but it also rang during the week if there was a fire or an emergency in the community, and people came to the church, found out what it was, and went to help. Then in 1943, our school burned down, which was on the corner of 65th and Juanetta, and the church very generously offered to share their space with the school district. They didn't know it was going to be for 5 years, but that made some major changes in the church. The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grades were in the East Room, and that's where I started grade school the next year when I was 5. In the sanctuary, the pews were moved as far forward as they could be, and we had north-south tables with 4 desks in each side in the back of the sanctuary. That was the 4th, 5th, and 6th. And the 7th and 8th grades were in the West Room, and that was the beginning of when they took out the partition between that small room and the big room. No bathrooms, 2 outhouses out back, cold in the winter. And oftentimes a teacher would send a slow reader up into the pew area with a good reader, and that's how our pews got initials scratched all over the backs. We met here for 5 years, and we got a new furnace that would burn coal as well as wood, because you were never really warm here, because even though someone came on Saturday morning and started the fire, it was not really pleasant, even by Sunday, after burning all day. And sometimes, maybe in the afternoon, that furnace would go out, and you would arrive and the church would be ice cold. But you still came to church. You just wore your coats. We didn't need a coat rack. We all kept them on. At the end of the 5 years, we got a school again, our own school building. And on the last day of school, every child in that school, and there were about 75 at that time, made a line from the church to the corner of Juanetta and 65th. And that's the way the books and the supplies were moved, was one child at a time in a line. And then the next year we started in our new school. But meanwhile, the rich life at the church still went on. There were just so many things to do, it seemed like. We had lots of potlucks in the basement. Sometimes we roller skated in the basement. And then the Cydrus family came in 1949. And Royce Cydrus, the wife, was the one appointed as our pastor. Her husband was a pastor also, but in the Christian church denomination. So she came to preach, but she had a very odd voice that broke when she would speak. And we all preferred listening to her husband. And oh, how our church grew. It was common to have 50 kids in the Sunday school. I have a picture with 50 kids in the Bible school and people helping. We just did all kinds of things. And the MYF, the young people's group, became stronger. People came from Valley Ford because they didn't have any church, because Valley Chapel had closed by that time. So we were the only church between whatever was in the valley and downtown Spokane. And people didn't travel downtown from out here to go to church in those days. They came to the closest church, whether they were Lutheran or Baptist, whatever. They came to the Moran church. And he was here from 1948, maybe, 48 or 49, until the year I got married at 17, 1956. And at that time, the Methodist Conference was very intent on pulling us back into the Methodist banner. Before that, our pastors had come. Sometimes they were Methodists, sometimes they were Baptists, sometimes they were Nazarene, whoever we could get to fill the pulpit. By the time I was a teenager, it was getting very hard to fill the pulpit, because while we had a lot of constituents, we didn't have many attenders. But the Methodist Conference began to pull us back. And the year I was married was when they made this church make the break, that we would always have a Methodist pastor if we wanted to continue under their conference. There was a horrible dust-up between our good pastor and the district superintendent that almost tore this church apart. But it still held strong. And so we've gone on as Methodists rather than Methodist Episcopal. And then we became United Methodists. And when John Martin came to our church, without asking anyone, he and one of our male members tore out the wall that was those opening doors and made an office in the north end of the East Room. And I don't know why, but that upset me terribly. But the church still kept on through all the pastors. We had either a brand new pastor just out of seminary, or we had a pastor that was way past retirement. And our church got smaller and smaller. When when Reverend Sidrus was forced to leave in 1957, shortly into the new year, we fell upon really hard times, and our membership dwindled and dwindled because by the 60s and 70s, people were beginning to drive to the church they came from when they moved out here. They never ever came to this church. They went back to their Lutheran church or their Baptist church or whatever. But then in the 80s, all of us who had grown up in this church and stayed began to have older children, and our Sunday school began to grow again. And we got, Betty Smith came as our permanent pastor. Now, when John was the pastor here, I'm sorry, but he preached over most of the people's heads. My husband wouldn't come because he couldn't understand John's preaching. But my husband loved Betty's preaching. He could hear her and he could understand what she said. And she built this church immeasurably, enough so that we could begin to think about expanding, because we didn't have any space except the basement, which was still cold. The lights weren't good. And that was when they began to put in the drywall, so that by the time my daughter was married here, the basement looked pretty good. And it was light, but still hard for people to go down to for a potluck. So those things dwindled. But our church year was so busy. Early in spring, the Sunday school had what was called Buttercup Sunday. And the end of March or the first part of April, whichever child brought in the first buttercup got $1. And then when they were plentifully growing, we had Buttercup Sunday. A song was written for that Sunday, and the children made arrangements that they brought. Maybe a mirror for a pond in a shallow bowl, and moss and twigs for trees, and then planted all around with buttercups. And those were judged, and the winner got $1. Then we had Mother's Day. And Mother's Day was so exciting because that's when the mothers were honored. Not anything for Father's Day, but on Mother's Day, the oldest mother got a corsage. The youngest mother got a corsage. I won that one the year I was 18. The mother with the most children won a corsage, and the mother with the most children present won a corsage. And they were beautiful. But that one almost always went to Agnes Sacker or Esther Johnson, because her children were at home and they would all come on Mother's Day. My mother had 5 children, but there were only ever 2 of us at home in my lifetime. And then in the summer we had a picnic, but we never had it at church. We always went to Comstock Park because there was a pool that the kids could swim in, and that was a big deal to us out here because the boys went up to the dam, but we didn't. That was our chance to go swimming. And the food sat out on the table until we ate in the afternoon, and nobody ever got sick from the potato salad or the cottage cheese that sat out there in the heat. We all ate it and were just fine. And there were always ice cream bars packed in dry ice for the dessert. But our church year really started in the fall. Sunday school met, of course, all through the summer, but was very, very scantily attended because kids worked. They worked in the fields or around their own houses, in the garden, and so there weren't many at church in the summer. But in September, we really geared up for the year. We didn't do anything at Thanksgiving, but at Christmas, December was such a busy month, And when the school was here, it had a Christmas program with a bag of treats. The church had a Christmas program with a bag of treats. It was just a great month all the way around. But we did not have Christmas Eve services. And if Christmas Day didn't fall on a Sunday, we didn't come to church. People were busy at their own homes. But the MYF always went caroling on Christmas Eve. They would begin at about 6 o'clock in the evening when the chores were done. And the MYF leader, who was John Snyder, would bring his Studebaker truck, and we would all load into the back of the truck with quilts and blankets and drive to all the older people's homes in our community, not just our church people, but everyone who lived out too far to come. And were we cold? Yes. Every place we stopped, got out, tromped through the snow up to the door. We never, ever went in. And when I was really young, I really resented that because my sister wouldn't get home until 9 o'clock. And by then, my dad had gone to sleep on the couch. My grandma was nodding in her chair, and I was wild with anticipation because it was my birthday, and we always opened our gifts on Christmas Eve because my father was a florist and had to get up and go to work at 4 o'clock the next morning. So Christmas was it was a wonderful month filled with all kinds of things to do. The MYF always had a watch party, and at 12:15 we all piled into that same truck with the blankets and the comforters, and he took us home. And we were done by 12:15. That was so far beyond our bedtimes that we had nothing left. After our picnic in the summer, we were free until fall, and in the fall we began to take a ride for the older congregants. And we would go to a place like maybe the Mullen Tree or some scenic spot. And it was wonderful because older people just didn't drive. They stayed home. You know, this church has been alive for so many years, and we'll never know how many people found their dearest friend here. We don't know that, but we know they did. And we know we must help continue it. We know that God is still calling. What can we do but answer?